Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight to celebrate author Cassandra Johnson and her new book, Finding Refuge, Hard Work for the Healing Collective Grief. My name is Morella and I am the Events and Social Media Coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming tonight and supporting Flyleaf and Michelle. We are recording tonight's event so that it's more accessible to the public, and it will be up in our YouTube channel soon. And also we do ask that we finalize the event by 7 p.m. today so that we can be mindful of our colleagues. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's author. Cassandra Johnson is a social justice warrior, author, dismantling racism trainer, empath, yoga teacher and practitioner, and intuitive healer. With more than 20 years of experience leading dismantling racism workshops and working with clients as a licensed clinical social worker, she has a deep understanding of how trauma impacts the mind, body, spirit, and heart. Her awareness of the world through her own experience as a Black woman allows her to know firsthand how privilege and power operate. So, please give it up for tonight's author.
Thank you so much for welcoming me into this space, and thanks y'all for being here. It's good to see you, see familiar faces, and it's weird and cool to be back where I used to live. All day I've kind of been like, where am I here? Where am I? Because some things feel the same and so many things feel different. So thanks for making time and space to be here in space with me. I'm excited to talk to you all about Finding Refuge and to read from Finding Refuge. And I also want to share that my first book, Skill in Action, the second edition, comes out on November 2nd. And I just bought this here because the publisher hasn't sent copies yet. And so I walked in and saw Finding Refuge and saw this for the first time and got to hold it, and I'm very excited about it. So it was really sweet. They got permission, which I didn't know, from the publisher to get copies early for this. So it will be out, well, it's here now, and officially November 2nd is the date. And I'm excited. It feels synchronous to be in this space and to have this here. Yes. I'm good. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, if that changes, just let me know. I mean, I'm amongst friends and chosen family. So for this reading, I would love for us to begin with a meditation. Tonight, there's a full moon, and I can feel it in my body. And so I would like to take a moment for us to ground in this space. And the full moon is in Aries. So fire, fire, fire. So I'll invite you all to find a comfortable way to be in your body. And you can close your eyes, or you can soften your gaze or find a grounding focal point in this space. And we're going to take some time to breathe and touch into the heart, since Finding Refuge is about the heart and healing. And I invite you to bring your awareness and attention to the breath. Begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And as you touch into the breath, begin to deepen and lengthen it. A more expansive inhale and a deeper release as you exhale. As you deepen your breath, notice what is present for you at this time. How are you? How is your heart? How is your spirit? and let whatever needs to come up to the surface rise. Allow your breath to meet whatever is present for you at this time, whatever is moving through you or whatever you're moving through. Allow your breath to meet it. Allow your broken and open and resilient and tender heart to meet these times. And if there is a wish, a prayer you would like to bring into your awareness, connected with our collective healing, I invite you to uplift your prayer or wish now. I invite you to take 5 deep breaths, settling into this space a little more. And continue to breathe as you feel ready. You can gently blink open your eyes if they're closed. Take a moment to return to this space and to each other. Welcome. So I'd love to share where this came from, how it emerged, and my process of writing it, and I'll share some about the structure and then read a few of the sections from the book and open it up for questions. And people do keep asking me, like, when did you think about writing a book about grief? And my answer to this question continues to shift as I learn more, because I didn't know we'd be here like this when I sat down to write the book proposal for this, and when I began to write the first chapter of the book, which is about my mother and when she was sick, which I'll share some about. I didn't know we would be still losing people in a global pandemic and reckoning in the way we are and we have been in this intense, sticky, edgy way. I didn't know. And so I think this book came from the ancestors, in particular my grandmother Dorothy and my great-grandmother Angie. And I believe they gave me an assignment. And the introduction is all about the moment when I found out George Zimmerman was acquitted for murdering Trayvon Martin, which was this pivotal moment in my life, and it still continues to break my heart in so many ways, like profoundly deep ways, and still brings up a lot of tenderness for me. And in the moment when I heard about the acquittal, as is written about in the introduction, I fell to the floor, and I watched myself be in pieces, and I was also witnessing and trying to figure out, will I ever be whole again? That was the question, and there was a lot of fear, and I also was kind of unsure of what was happening to me, because in that moment, it wasn't just my grief. It was like all of the ancestral grief. It was the world's grief. It was the grief connected to the things we had not yet and still have not reckoned with and healed. It was everything moving up and out. And so it felt like my whole body shattered, and I could see myself and didn't know what to do about it. And I think that's the moment. I think the ancestors were like, you're gonna have to feel this. You're gonna have to allow it to move through you. You will come apart, and then you will come back together. Looking back, in that moment, I was kind of like, what the hell is going on? But looking back and reflecting on it now, I do think that was like the moment. They were like, you're gonna have this assignment, and you will need to talk about grief during a time when we will be in a space of great grief that we haven't experienced before, of loss we haven't experienced before in this particular way. So I think finding refuge came from them. And I think the need to heal the heart came from them, because I believe I carry their brokenheartedness inside me, as well as their resilience and their joy and their strength. All of that is coursing through me in my body and in my heart. So that's a little about where it came from. The other thing I'll say about how this emerged is, as I was writing the book proposal and needed to submit the first chapter along with the introduction, my mother was hospitalized in April of 2020. So she was in the middle of that, and that lasted until hospitals and skilled nursing facilities until about July of 2020, or 2019, because she got sick again in 2020. So that was 2019. And I witnessed a system and many systems that are supposed to be about caring for people, not care for her at all. And I knew it, like I knew this is what we do to each other and this is how systems are designed. And still I was like utterly brokenhearted from watching people be so dissociated that they didn't like understand my mother was a human who was sick and needed care. And so that definitely informed this process of writing the book. And she was sick and she was going to die. Like everyone that was going to happen. We thought that was going to happen. She thought it was going to happen. She got better, she went home, and then in December of 2019, she went to the hospital again and was sick again. And she was in the hospital and in skilled nursing facilities. And she went to move into a retirement community in February of 2020. So right before, many of us knew about COVID-19, which to me feels like a miracle in so many ways. And during that time of her illness, she was close to death. She was talking to the ancestors, she told me so. She was out of her mind most of the time, but when she was like in her body for a moment, she said, I'm talking to them. My mom was there, my grandmother Dorothy, and the others. And so she was preparing to leave here, and I'm so grateful that she's here, and then I get to spend more time with her on Earth, even though I think I faced, I know she's going to transition one day, and so I was sitting there preparing for that. And I don't know what I'll do when it actually happens, but we've been through it. We've been through the fire together. And something feels so important about our experience of moving through that fire together. So that's some about this book and where it's from and how I sat with it. The book has 7 chapters, and it has practices after each one and rituals. So I believe there are 8 rituals, maybe 9 in here actually, because one chapter has 2. They're all experiences of grief, my own personal experiences of grief, and then they're scaled to the collective. Like, what are we doing to each other? Why are we not focusing on our grief and how our hearts are broken? Why are we not working to move back into wholeness and to practice collective care? And there's a real call in here, which I think is massive and daunting, for us to turn towards the things that we do not want to feel, that we may not want to see, that perhaps feel too big for us to hold. There's a call to turn toward these things so that we can heal. Because I don't feel like we can heal unless we move through the stuff, right? To be in that fire, I don't think we will heal unless we're clear that we need to flow through and move through this fire. So that's a little about the book. There's a chapter I'll read from, actually about my mom, and I will read the chapter about my friend Eric, who I actually met in Chapel Hill when I first moved here to go to graduate school. And since I'm here, it feels like I need to read about him and call him into this space. I felt that on the way over here. And then I'll see where I am. There's a chapter about the honeybees. I might talk about them. We will see. So that's a little about finding refuge. So I also want to say the title, so Skill in Action, is from the Bhagavad-Gita, which is, many of you may be familiar with the text, some of you may not. It is an ancient text, it's sacred. Many yoga practitioners or people who study yoga are familiar with the Bhagavad-Gita. There's another text called the Yoga Sutras, which is as poignant and important for us, I'd say everyone, but in particular people who have a spiritual practice or want to develop a spiritual practice. Finding refuge is also from the Bhagavad-Gita. There's a verse in the Bhagavad-Gita that is, no effort is wasted, no gain ever reversed. Even a little of this practice will shelter you from sorrow. The original title was Shelter from Sorrow, and my editor, because the publisher decides what the title of the book is, and I love the title, but they decide, she found an interpretation of that same verse that talks about finding refuge through your practice of leaning into your dharma, the work you're most meant to do. And so that is where the title is from. It's from the Bhagavad-Gita. So I wanted to share that. So I will share and read a little about my mother. Her name is Clara. I pulled up an image of lavender blue on my phone to make sure I had the exact color she spoke of. She nodded her head, pointed to the phone, and put her index finger on the screen. She seemed pleased that I was able to find such a beautiful shade of lavender blue. I was trying to decipher what she meant when she said lavender blue and cinnamon. I wondered if she was perhaps telling me what color she wanted to be buried in, while also remembering the cinnamon color of the bridesmaids' dresses for my wedding. Or maybe she was remembering the lavender blue hydrangeas that lived in my grandmother's backyard, and the ones that surprised me in my backyard when I purchased my home in Winston-Salem. She lay there in a hospital bed, confused, affirming that she felt like she was underwater. Sometimes I feel underwater when I fly, changing altitude and time zones, or when I haven't slept, which has been a chronic problem since childbirth. My experiences of being submerged are tame in comparison to what my mother was feeling. She felt like she was drowning, and I believe that might actually happen. My mother had lost 30 pounds, refused to eat or drink, and seemed to be leaving her physical body and moving on to another realm. She had spent 10 weeks in beds that weren't her own, in hospitals and skilled nursing facilities that didn't feel like home, receiving a lack of care and compassion from the system of healthcare. My mother had entered the hospital on April 5th, 2 days after I went to visit her for her belated birthday celebration. On my drive back to Richmond, this time to visit her in the hospital, many thoughts raced through my mind. The doctors had started to run tests on my mother, and I knew she was experiencing the medical system as she and I always have, as a place where our wisdom about our own bodies is dismissed. For over a decade prior to this hospitalization, doctors had given my mother cortisone shots in her knees, put stockings on her to move lymph through her body and flush her system, administered breathing tests because of her asthma, poked and prodded her, all the while doubting her when she would say, "No, I don't have diabetes," because the assumption, if you're an overweight Black woman, is that you must have terrible eating habits and have diabetes. My heart felt my mother's, and I knew she was re-experiencing what it's like to be treated as a subject instead of a human being. After her first week in the first hospital, the doctor, who was white, had come into the room, and my mother had said, "Give me the bad news first." The doctor had started to laugh, not recognizing the power he embodied. He was there to tell my mother what was wrong with her. He had the medical degree, and he controlled how many tests were to be done on my mother's body, as well as when she would be discharged from the hospital. He said, "We think you have a pinched nerve, and we want to discharge you to a skilled nursing facility to receive physical and occupational therapy." My mom looked confused. I piped up and said, "How is she going to do therapy when she cannot sit up? She screams in excruciating pain whenever someone comes in to adjust her bed from horizontal toward vertical. She cannot move, walk, or sit up. How are you going to discharge her now?" While I had appreciated the doctor pulling up a chair and having very good bedside manner, I was angry, not just for my mother, but for all the people who are seen as bodies that are not valued in this culture. He then asked, "Oh, she cannot sit up?" He should have known this fact. Her body had been in the hospital for 6 days, with him as her doctor for all 6 of those days. Trying to keep my cool and stay centered while encountering and challenging a doctor who has been trained in a medical institution to believe he is all-knowing and conditioned by a world that values his whiteness over my mother's wellness, I angrily stated, "No, she cannot sit up." If I hadn't been in the room, I am certain my mother would have been discharged. Diagnosis, pinched nerve. Treatment, physical and occupational therapy. The doctor reluctantly ordered 2 more tests, an X-ray of her spine and an MRI of her brain. Had he not run those tests, he would have not discovered that my mother had cervical spinal stenosis, causing the pinched nerve, and an infection in her lumbar spine. Her spine, at the top and bottom, were literally out of alignment and inflamed. I couldn't help but see the parallel between my mother's illness and the sickness that dominant culture perpetuates. My mother had an infection in her spine, at the root of her spine. My mother's vertebrae were not only inflamed and infected, but there was also minimal cartilage between them. Her spine was compressed, making it more difficult for her to stand or sit upright and tall. While my mother and I were challenged by dominant culture through the system of healthcare at every turn, I kept considering the infection dominant culture has at the root, never allowing us to physically or psychically stand upright and tall in our humanity. Almost 3 months later, after my mother's illness had continued through 3 hospitals and 3 skilled nursing facilities, I sat with her in the 3rd hospital as she struggled to express feelings through words. When she couldn't, she tried to write them down, producing squiggly lines that left her worried about herself and me heartbroken. She could tell she'd become progressively confused. Her lack of lucidity, coupled with her deteriorating body, made her mostly pleasant and docile. The nurses kept commenting on how cute she was. I just sat back and thought, she's a 76-year-old woman. Children are cute. My mother is sick and looks near death. Nothing about this situation is cute. By the time my mom was taken to Virginia Commonwealth University Hospital, she was being given fluids by IV and she wasn't eating. She refused to nourish her body. She told me she was dying and said, "It won't be long now." When I was born, the afterbirth emerged before me, causing the doctors and nurses to pull me out rather forcefully into this brutal and beautiful world. They moved me to a different hospital away from my mother for 9 days. I was placed in an incubator while my 2-pound, 3-ounce body tried to sustain life. And now I watched my mother approaching death in that same hospital. At times, my breath was taken away by this reality. How did I end up in the same hospital as the one I had been in as a baby, fighting for my life, now watching my mother's health decline? I sat with her, and while I didn't support her not eating or drinking, I also didn't support giving her a feeding tube. I understood my mother. Her body was tired, her heart dispirited, and she trusted that she was going to be with my grandmother, Dorothy, who had transitioned just a 1.5 years before. She told me she'd been talking to my grandmother and the others. My mother, talking with spirit and the ancestors, calmed me. I was glad she didn't feel alone. It was difficult for my mother to communicate with those of us trying to offer her support in the physical realm, and I was glad she could find support in the ethereal realm. As she spoke with our ancestors in spirit, I knew a decision was being made about whether it was time to stay here in her physical body or move beyond her body into the fullness of her spirit. What I'll say about this chapter goes on to share more about her journey and my journey with her, and it ends with a practice about the heart and a call for us to turn towards our hearts and what is breaking them at this time and how we feel fragmented. And she is in her retirement community. She is thriving. I just saw her about 3 weeks ago. And she is a miracle. Like every time I see her, I'm kind of like, you're here. Like you're physically here with me and you're doing well. And I'm so grateful. And so she's doing well. And she seems happy, and it took her a while to settle into the retirement community. Also, she went from skilled nursing to the retirement community. She never went back to her home because she'd already started planning to move to this retirement community before she got sick again. So I had to get a moving company and try to figure that out. And she moved from a 3-bedroom house into a 1-bedroom apartment. And so she was disoriented and still kind of sick, not well in the way she is now. And so it took her a while, but now she's going to art class and she is a walker. And so she walks the halls every night to get her exercise, and everyone knows her in the retirement community, and she's doing well. So that's the update about my mother. In this chapter in the practice, there's a mantra or statement that is, I feel my heart, I acknowledge my heart. I feel my heartbeat, I acknowledge my heartbeat. So I'm going to read about Eric. I lose track of time, so just want to make sure I'm honoring the time. This chapter is about my friend Eric Diener, who, as I met him when I moved here for grad school, to go to school in social work. The School of Social Work. And his roommate, Trisha, yes, his roommate was my friend in grad school. We were in the same cohort. And so I met him, and we dated for, I think, 2 years or 2.5 years, and then we broke up, and then we kind of dated again, and then we broke up, and then we had a 7 or 8 year friendship. And he was the person I would call when I was kind of like, I don't know what to do. He would always remind me of who I am. At the core, he would remind me of that, and he would problem solve with me, and he was a beloved. We would go visit him all the time in Asheville, and he passed away in 2008, December of 2008, and I'll read some about that. This chapter is about intuition, and it's about connecting with the heart's wisdom, and it's about how it's about how my spiritual practice helped me respond to losing a beloved like Eric. And it's also about tuning into the intuition and how my practice of connecting with my intuition deepened after he transitioned. So that's what it's about. Just going to figure out where to start. Okay. Let's start at the beginning. It's called Enlarged Hearts. It was a few days after the Christmas holiday, and my mother and grandmother had come to North Carolina for a visit. They had chosen to stay in Richmond for Christmas, but decided to come visit us right after the holiday to continue to celebrate. At the time, our house was being completely renovated. Jeff and I were living in my in-laws' rental house with our sweet dog, Maggie. The back half of the house was being redone with a new kitchen, pottery studio, 2 bathrooms, and an upstairs bedroom. The house was being gutted from the inside out. Little did we know that our lives were about to be gutted as well by the news of the loss of a dear friend. The first evening my mother and grandmother were there, I decided to make dinner and debunk my mother's narrative about my lack of cooking skills. I made chicken parmesan and a salad, and everyone seemed to enjoy the meal. The following afternoon, Jeff and I were preparing to go to a wedding ceremony for a friend and former colleague. I was sitting on the couch, putting on my high heels, almost ready to leave, and I decided to check my email. I saw an email from my friend Laura, the wife of my close friend Eric Diener. The subject line in the email from Laura read, "About Eric. I opened it and read it over in disbelief. Laura's email said that they had been out to dinner in Wetumpka, Alabama, and were paying their bill as they prepared to leave the restaurant. Laura heard Eric try to say something to her, but when she turned toward him, he fell on the back of his chair and knocked over an empty chair behind him. He had what appeared to be a seizure and was unconscious. After being taken to the ER and unconscious for 50 minutes, the doctors were able to resuscitate Eric. He was transferred to a hospital in Montgomery, and he was there when I received the email from Laura. He was in the ICU, unable to breathe on his own. His heart muscles were very weak, and it was likely that he had a cardiac arrest and a blood clot that traveled from his heart to his brain. The CT scan of his lungs showed mild pneumonia, and his heart and brain had been without oxygen for a long time. The damage to these organs was significant. She believed it would take another couple days before they would know more about the prognosis of his condition. I was in shock and disbelief upon reading this email. I couldn't believe it was referencing my 39-year-old friend. I shared the news with Jeff, and we felt the impulse to go be with Eric, but we had a wedding to attend. I called Laura, and she told us to wait until the next day to come and see them. She told me that she thought Eric understood what was happening, and that at times he had tears streaming down his face. He couldn't talk, but Laura felt like he knew the gravity of his condition. Jeff and I went to our friend's wedding and tried to be in a celebratory mood, but our minds and hearts were with Eric and his family. The next morning, I received a phone call from Laura. Eric had passed away earlier that day. As Laura shared the news with me, I heard her words but couldn't process them. I was in shock. I went into the guest room to tell my mom and grandmother the news, and I burst into tears. Without my saying anything, my mother knew that Eric was gone. We sat on the edge of the bed, and my mother held me as I sobbed. During the days after Eric's passing, I communicated the news with friends, wrote his obituary for our local paper, spoke with his parents, and supported Laura in planning a gathering at their home in Asheville, North Carolina. I handled the details and automatically went into planning mode, not as a way of avoiding my grief, well, at least not consciously, but as a way to honor a friend and beloved who had played such an enormous role in my life. The immensity of Eric's influence on my life matched the deep grief I felt over losing him. I met Eric in 1996 when I moved to Chapel Hill, North Carolina to attend UNC Chapel Hill School of Social Work. I was classmates with one of his roommates, Tricia, and met him shortly after the first semester began. The first semester of graduate school was challenging. A month after I began school, I was sexually assaulted. After the assault, I went to the hospital and then to Tricia's house. Over the next few days, I slept and cried a lot, communicated with my professors about not being able to come to class, and I avoided going back to my apartment. The assault didn't occur there, but I didn't want to explain to my roommates what had happened and where I'd been all weekend. Eric kept his distance, but he was concerned about me. That was the beginning of my relationship with Eric. He was going through his own trauma at that time. He was separated and getting a divorce. Both of us felt tender and a bit broken. This may have been why the gravitational pull between us was so strong. That first semester and for a few years to come, Eric became my lover, confidant, and mirror. When our romantic relationship ended a couple of times, we managed to create a different kind of relationship, a deep and everlasting friendship. I would call Eric for advice and support when I needed. We would frequently check in with each other, sharing about how our lives were shifting and changing based on new jobs, moving to different towns, homes, pets, or ventures we had begun. As the years went on, Eric became friends with Jeff, and I became friends with Laura. We would all go on long hikes together, and time again, Eric would act as if we were lost, and then somehow lead us to a beautiful vista, looking down into a valley to watch the sunset over the Blue Ridge Mountains. This was the essence of Eric, a beautiful vista, looking down into a valley in the middle of a mountain range that felt massive, reminding Eric he was a small part of a tremendous and nuanced ecosystem. An enlarged heart sent a clot to Eric's brain, which caused swelling and ultimately his death. The doctors weren't sure if his heart was enlarged prior to the blood clot developing, or if it came from the impact of trying to resuscitate him. There was one story of him having what seemed like a heart attack in college, but the ER doctors chalked it up to him potentially drinking too much. We all asked questions about his heart. trying to figure out the origin and an explanation for something that truly was unexplainable. Our 39-year-old beloved passing away. Enlarged hearts are believed to come from an underlying issue causing the heart to work harder. I cannot help but think that Eric's enlarged heart came from his sensitivity to the trauma he witnessed and was aware of in his own life and beyond in the greater world. I'm going to skip ahead in this chapter because I want to share a story about a space that you all might know here, which is Bowling Creek. After he passed away, we had a memorial in Asheville, and then a group of us here had a memorial in Carborough and Chapel Hill. And so my friend Chris built a bench in honor of Eric, and that bench went to the Carborough side of Bowling Creek. And there's the story about the bench, that's what I want to read. And then we planted a tree on the Chapel Hill side of Bowling Creek with a rock and like a plaque there because he loved Bowling Creek. He's the person who introduced me to that. So I want to share about that because the bench has quite a beautiful story. I just have to get to it. All right, here we go. So this is a story about us being in the forest one day. I was in the forest with Jeff, and we couldn't find the bench. One day I walked into the forest with the intention of visiting Eric's bench. I walked to where it had been located, but what I found was an empty space. No bench or evidence it had been there. The prior week we had strong rains and the creek flooded. I assumed the bench washed away, but I couldn't find it anywhere. About a year later, Jeff and I were in the forest, making our way out of the woods, and we saw the bench sitting up high on a hill above the creek. Astonished, we wondered how a bench that was heavy and sturdy made its way a mile down the creek and up on a hill. Jeff took a picture of me sitting on the bench, and we posted it on Facebook. The response was immediate. I know that bench. I've sat on it many times. I saw that bench covered in debris in the creek. I love that bench and have wondered where it went. One person responded and shared the story of finding the bench near its current location. He decided to pull it out of the creek and noticed a plaque on it that read, "Dear life traveler, take a moment and allow the sounds of nature to awaken your inner silence and take you into your subconscious where your deepest truths lie. Love your life and its gifts. In honor of our dear friend Eric Edwin Diener." The man realized the bench was meaningful to someone, and he dragged it up the hill above the creek so it would be safe from the rain and the risk of washing away, which I love. Like, he knew it meant something to someone, and it was heavy, and he dragged it up there on his own to this higher place where it would be protected. Like, what if we did that in all the ways we need to, as much as we could for people? Eric moved his bench down a river and up on a hill where he wanted travelers to come and sit and view the water, listen to the wind and birds, and awaken their deepest truths, remembering to love their life and the gifts it offers. On the day we spread his ashes at Graveyard Fields, which is outside of Asheville, we went on a long hike. And after hiking for a bit, I looked down on the ground and saw a heart-shaped rock looking back at me. I knew it was representative of Eric's heart, and it was special to hold it in my hand. It was a reminder that Eric's spirit was expansive. He was in the rocks, trees, stream, mountains, wind, and grass. He was everywhere. Today, that heart-shaped rock sits atop my ancestor altar. And the rest of this is about intuition again, because I found rocks, I found all sorts of things that connected me to Eric and began to listen to my intuition more deeply. And as I named, it's about the connection of the heart and the intuition and the heart's wisdom. So I think I'm going to read from one more chapter and then open it up for if you have questions or things. I want to read from the chapter 6. It's about the honeybees. And I'll just read a little of it. I had 3 honeybee hives, and now I have 2 because I had to combine 2 of my honeybee hives. Over the last 3 weeks, my honeybees have, 2 of the hives have had hungry bees. I was calling them robber bees, but they're actually just hungry, and they want to have enough for winter, and so they're foraging honey from other hives that they think are weaker than theirs, which is quicker than gathering pollen, and then the bee coming back and giving that pollen to an indoor bee, and then that gets passed along until a certain amount of the water content is out of it, and then they make honey. It takes like a ton of bees to make a tiny bit of honey. So I'm trying to have compassion for these bees that are hungry. And at times I have, and other times I've been like, stop decimating my hive and these bees. It's challenging to hold compassion for that, and they just don't have what they need, like so many people don't have what they need. And the reframing of hungry, like, you know, instead of robbing, right? That's totally different. So this went on, the hungry bees showed up from all different hives, actually. I don't know how the word gets out, pheromones is how they communicate, but like hungry bees can come from like 6 different hives. All of a sudden they come into the hive, and I did everything that the internet told me to do. I did all the things, y'all, and nothing would stop this cycle. And it was really hard to watch. And so I was going to move the hives, and I had a friend who said, yes, I mean, without hesitation, you can move them here to recover and heal. And I was going to move them, preparing, and then something told me to combine these 2 hives. And so that's what I did. And I just went in yesterday to see how it went, and they're good. Saw the queen. They're doing well. It's a process to combine hives, I will say that, because they have to get used to each other. But they only had 1 queen in there because one of the hives that had been experiencing the hungry bees, I believe the hungry bees killed the queen, which can happen in this kind of situation. And so they're doing well as 1 hive. And they're renamed Isis, which is a deity connected with putting people back together, is what I'll say. If you're interested, you can read about the myth of Osiris and Isis, which is actually in my next book, but you can read about it online later if you're interested. You don't have to wait for that. And how she transformed herself to pick up the pieces of Osiris and put him back together. So she's sitting on top of this combined hive, and that's their new name. So I'll just read a little, because this chapter is about collective care. And really, what I think I want to do is read the questions that I have at the end of this chapter. And this is about losing a hive over winter and having to harvest honey. They left a box of honey, they died, and having to harvest it without having what we needed to harvest it, and without expecting to have to harvest sweetness and honey amid so much death. And here we are, like trying to figure out how to do that. So I'll just read the final paragraph, because I think this is so much of what they ask us to do. And it is, this brings me back to the practice we could learn so much about, seeing ourselves as a whole hive and doing everything in service of the hive because of one's devotion to the hive. Generation upon generation of beings supporting the hive and larger ecosystem in which we exist, creating a process by which humanity and collective care for one another continues for infinity. What would it be like for us to embody a responsibility for our collective hive? What would it be like to create spaces for us to grieve what has been lost as a result of our forgetting that we are interconnected and part of a fragile and beautiful ecosystem, shared and composed of sentient beings whose survival is as important as our own? How might we begin to break down systems that separate us from remembering we are part of a hive and that we have different roles to ensure our collective liberation and survival? What would it feel like to be devoted to the liberation of all? And so these are the questions that the bees have invited me to sit with and that I will leave you with. And it was such an honor to be in the space. Thanks for showing up in this space in this way with me. And if anyone has questions, we have just a few minutes if there are any questions you want to ask or anything like that. Thank you. And no pressure to ask questions, but if you would like to, you can. In the time we have left. Yeah.
Do you always move slowly enough that you can see these patterns and have them become part of your conscious reality?
No, because I'm human, right?
Well, I was hoping you had
And we are
an answer.
limited. Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about the process, but I'm limited in my perspective, experience, understanding. There's so much that is unfolding that I don't understand, and I just try to make meaning of all of the time. To respond to some of that grief, like, oh, this is happening because of this. I don't really know why it's happening. I have some ideas. And one of the teachings in the Bhagavad-Gita is, where Finding Refuge is from, as I mentioned, is that, we're on the earthly realm and have work to do. And if we're too attached to this earthly realm, then it will be really difficult to do our work. And remember, we're spirit. And that we're spirit as well. This is the teaching from the Gita. One of them, there are many. And if we believe we can transcend the earthly realm and not do our work, that will cause suffering too. And so I remember that almost every day. I'm like, I'm in a body and I'm spirit. And remembering I'm spirit allows me to like slow down enough, to notice and process. And being in a body allows me to like slow down enough and process and then manifest something like this, where I can tell the story. And my friend said that, she said, you, move through experiences and like process them and then need to say something about them, right? And share them in a way that might benefit the collective, which is part of my dharma and work in the world. And she said, you take things from the spiritual realm and bring them into the material realm. And I think that's very true.
Yes.
And this book very much feels like that to me, that it's like, and it felt channeled and it felt like a shamanic journey because I had to go through all of the grief again. Every bit of it. I had to build altars for each person as I was writing it, for each being. I was instructed I could only write in a certain room in my house in a certain time of day, which was very different than the first edition of Skill in Action. It was so different. And so I do listen. Even though I don't understand everything that's unfolding, I listen to understand. So, and then I like get mad and have road rage and don't notice the honeybees. And then I do my human thing and I'm like, come back. There's something else. Stop acting that way. So yeah, thanks for your question. Any other questions before we close?
When did you do the writing? Like how long ago?
So the chapter about my mother was written in, I think it was the end of 2019, December of 2019, January of 2020. And then I wrote the book through, COVID was the backdrop. So
That's what I was curious.
January through, I turned in the manuscript in August of 2020. COVID and then everything else that erupted in the world. And I sat in my home socially isolating, working and writing this book about grief. And it came out on July 13th, which is 8 years after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, which I didn't know. They moved up my date. It was supposed to come out in August. And they were like, oh, it's in good shape. We're going to have it come out on July 13th. And I don't think that's like spirit to me. That's not a mistake. That's a cycle. That's, so deep when I found out that information. So, yeah. Thanks. Anything else? Okay. Thank you so much. So good to be in space with you all, and I hope to see you again sometime without these. Although I can feel your hearts and your smiles, and I hope there's a day when we aren't doing this and when I can hug you and all those things. I'm looking forward to it. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for coming tonight and supporting Flyleaf Books. If you're interested in any of our other upcoming events, you can check out on our website or sign up for our weekly newsletter. Thank you.
Thank you.